Imagine the world's greatest athletes, lauded for their physical prowess, suddenly cast in a far more sinister light. Behind the dazzling veneer of Olympic glory, where every stride and leap is celebrated as the pinnacle of human achievement, lies a shadowy underbelly of despair, crime, and tragedy. What happens when the spotlight fades and the champions fall from grace? What does it mean when the heroes who once inspired awe become figures of horror or victims of violence? From the tragic downfall of celebrated sprinters and boxers to the violent ends faced by legendary champions, these stories are a reminder that the Olympic stage, while a symbol of peak human achievement, can also be a backdrop for profound and unsettling narratives. In this video, I will delve into a chilling set of details about Olympians who have perpetuated terrible crimes and Olympians who became victims of crimes themselves. Drawing from my background as a former police officer, I'll uncover the jarring details, dissect the complex events, and delve into the theories surrounding these tragic and criminal episodes involving some of the world's most celebrated athletes. Let's get started. Riddick Bowe is a well-known heavyweight boxing champion, taking the title in one of the sport's golden eras, the 90s, alongside guys like Evander Holyfield, whom he beat twice and lost to once. Before his professional career, Bowe took the silver medal for the U.S. in Seoul. In 1998, Bowe committed a series of shocking crimes against his family. Seeking to rekindle his relationship with his estranged wife, Judy, Bowe kidnapped her and their 5 children at knife point from their home in Charlotte, North Carolina, and forced them into a car to head to his house in Fort Washington, Maryland. When they stopped at a McDonald's, Judy snuck into the bathroom and used a cell phone to ask a relative to call the police. Shortly after, police arrested Bowe. Brain damage was an issue in the trial, as a psychiatrist testified that Bowe had sustained so many punches to the head in the ring that it had affected his judgment to the degree where kidnapping his family seemed like a good idea. In 2000s, a judge in North Carolina sentenced Riddick Bowe to 30 days in federal prison, 6 months of house arrest, 4 years of probation, and an order to undergo medical treatment for brain injuries sustained in the ring. Oscar Pistorius, known as the Blade Runner for his carbon fiber prosthetic legs, made history as the first double amputee sprinter to compete in the Olympics. A citizen of South Africa, Pistorius was born without fibulas, one of the bones that connects your knee to your ankle, and his legs were amputated in infancy. Racing on thin, state-of-the-art carbon fiber prostheses, which earned him the nickname Blade Runner, Pistorius nevertheless became one of the greatest sprinters in the world, winning a gold medal in the 200-meter at the 2004 Paralympics, just 2 years after he took up running. In 2012, he became the first Paralympic sprinter to compete in the Olympics, running in the 400-meter. His success story turned dark in 2013 when he was arrested for the murder of his girlfriend. Pistorius said in the middle of the night he heard what he thought was a window opening in a bathroom. Thinking he had a home invasion on his hands, he grabbed his gun, approached the darkened room, sensed a presence, and started firing. It wasn't an intruder, however. It was his girlfriend, Reva Steenkamp. The prosecution argued the two had been fighting and that he killed her in anger. After a 7-month trial in 2014, a judge in South Africa found Pistorius guilty of culpable homicide, the equivalent of manslaughter, in that he acted recklessly but didn't mean to kill Steenkamp. He served a year of a 5-year sentence before a transfer to house arrest. An appellate court overturned that verdict, changing Pistorius's crime to murder. His sentence was then up to the legal minimum of 15 years behind bars. Dr. James Snook was a graduate of and later a professor at the Ohio State University's Veterinary College. He invented a widely used spaying tool called the Snook hook. Not only was he an accomplished veterinarian, but he was also good with a gun, and in 1920 he took his skills to the Olympics. At the age of 42, Snook won 2 gold medals, one for the 30-meter military pistol event and the other in the 50-meter. All that was a distant memory by 1926. When Snook began an affair with OSU student and veterinary college stenographer Thera Hicks, 23 years Snook's junior. Snook later described the relationship as one of carnal convenience. In June 1929, Snook took Hicks out for an evening of drug use and romance. During the encounter, Snook lashed out and struck Hicks with a hammer multiple times. He then used a pocket knife to kill her. After Hicks's remains were discovered, Snook was arrested and confessed. In February 1930, he met his end in the electric chair. But what about the Olympians who weren't killers, but unfortunately met a premature fate? Famously, Dave Schultz was murdered by his wealthy and mentally ill sponsor. Schultz was a Californian high school wrestling champion and attended the University of Oklahoma, where he became a 1982 NCAA champion. He was one of America's best-known international wrestlers in the 1980s, winning 6 medals at the World Championships, including a gold in 1984. He also won 10 U.S. national championships. When his competitive career ended, he became a coach and served as an assistant coach at the University of Wisconsin, Stanford, and his alma mater. In the early 90s, he was recruited by John DuPont of the DuPont family fortune to form an amateur wrestling team in the Philadelphia area called Team Foxcatcher. Schultz was the coach of the team and was also training for another shot at the Olympics in 1996 when he was shot and killed by DuPont. DuPont had been exhibiting very bizarre behavior in the months preceding the murder. Eventually, DuPont was found guilty and mentally ill, but not insane, and was sentenced to 15 to 30 years in prison. In a fit of protective rage, Manola Gallardo would lunge at Newport Beach millionaire William Bartholomew when she saw him standing in his bathrobe with a knife over her half-sister, who lay crumpled on the floor of the oil baron's Bayfront mansion. Gallardo wrested the knife from the 70-year-old millionaire's hands and stabbed him twice in the abdomen. Bartholomew, an Olympian, well-known sailing champion, and oil tycoon, would die on the kitchen floor of his mansion in Los Angeles in 1963 due to a tragic misunderstanding. A jury would eventually find Gallardo not guilty of manslaughter in Bartholomew's death. Gallardo, 31, a Spanish housekeeper, could speak no English. If Bartholomew had been able to speak a few words of Spanish, he might have been able to tell Gallardo that her sister Carmen had fallen in the kitchen seconds earlier while chopping up some mushrooms for breakfast. Carmen Bartholomew, 25, a former dancer, was married to William Bartholomew's brother Charles. She was still recovering from giving birth to her first child a few weeks earlier when she felt a sharp pain in her abdomen while cooking breakfast and collapsed on the floor that day, according to contemporary news accounts. Bartholomew competed in the mixed 6-meter sailing event at the 36 Summer Olympics. Olympic sprinter Christopher Braithwaite was killed in 1984 while he was running when a troubled student dressed in combat gear opened fire indiscriminately at the University of Oregon's football stadium. The killer, later identified as Michael Evan Fear, then took his own life. Fear, who was 19 years old, was a University of Oregon freshman from Everett, Washington. Those who were close to Fear said he was often easily influenced by fads, wanted to be a rock star, and was overwhelmed by personal problems. It was claimed that he was unable to deal with the slightest pressure. The academic year of 1983 to 84 found Fear with failing grades, excessive spending, and financial issues, and lastly, a breakup with his then-girlfriend. He allegedly told his then-girlfriend at one time that he had fantasized about breaking into a Bi-Mart store and stealing ammunition, then getting involved in some kind of a shooting episode. His shooting spree lasted more than 3 hours. Numerous marks in the jogging paths Braithwaite was running on, along with bullet fragments recovered, indicate that Fear shot at Braithwaite multiple times while he ran quite some distance. Officers found several shell casings in the bleacher area and in a concession booth which had a view of the jogging trail. The distance from the concession booth to where Braithwaite's body was over 800 feet. The shooter was also found to have used cocaine before the shooting. Braithwaite, who was 35 at the time of his death, was a former student at the university who was a Trinidad native and a member of Trinidad's 1976 and 1980 Olympic track team. Braithwaite also competed for the University of Oregon track team. In the aftermath of the shooting, friends, fellow athletes, CO workers, and children Braithwaite had counseled at the Skipworth Juvenile Correction Center expressed shock and a deep sense of loss. Braithwaite had worked there as a social worker and juvenile counselor for 8 years. He left behind a wife and a son, Sean, who was only 5 years old at the time. Colin Ridgway was the first Australian to play in the NFL and represented Australia at the '56 Olympics. As a high jumper, he became the first athlete to clear 7 foot. Ridgway was shot at least 7 times by an intruder as he entered his duplex after a night out with his wife, Joan Jackson. Jackson had driven a separate car home and entered through the back door to find her husband in a pool of blood with shooting wounds to the back of his head. She called and told a dispatcher her husband had suffered a heart attack later, telling tabloids she could only see his back. He just kept heaving. I thought he had finally suffered a heart attack or a stroke coming up the stairs, Jackson would recount. Jackson's call raised the suspicions of police and Ridgway's friends, who offered a reward for information relating to the murder. Archived reports show Jackson told police she'd been watering flowers out the back of the house and had not heard any shots as she entered the house. Police attempted to pin the death as a murder for hire organized by Jackson, but a year after Ridgway's death, a judge refused to indict her, leaving the widow free to continue public professions of innocence. In one television interview, she told her detractors to go to hell and accused her husband of being a drug smuggler to Mexico who had been killed by business associates. Joan Ridgway's daughters from an earlier marriage haven't spoken to their mother since Colin was killed. In September 1994, her 2 daughters, alleged in a federal lawsuit, eventually settled out of court that Joan was partly responsible for the murder. Ridgway's murder is still unsolved. On September 5, 1972, a group of Palestinian terrorists did a pre-dawn raid on the Olympic Village. They targeted the Israeli athletes and managed to take 9 of them hostage. The group was called Black September. They held 9 Israelis hostage and demanded that in exchange for their lives, over 230 Palestinians be released from Israeli jails. Unfortunately, negotiations between the 2 sides broke down, and the ski mask-wearing Black September members took off for the airport, hostages in tow. Once they got there, a fight broke out, and all the hostages were killed. Some of the terrorists managed to escape, but were eventually tracked down by Mossad. Despite the tragedy, it only disrupted a couple of days of the games. A memorial service was held, and the IOC president Avery Brundage called for the Olympics to continue, just to prove the terrorists hadn't won. The second worst act of terror at an Olympic game after Munich was the explosion at the Atlanta Games on July 27th in 1996. It happened at 1:25 p.m. in the Centennial Olympic Park. A 40-pound bomb was placed and detonated near a sound tower. CNN reported the culprit had placed it and then called the police saying they had half an hour before it went off. The area was able to be partially cleared before the bomb exploded 22 minutes later. One woman was killed by the actual explosion, while a cameraman died of a heart attack while running to film the scene of the crime. Over 200 people were injured by the flying nails and screws. Despite fears of a second bomb going off, visitors didn't let it keep them away from the events. And President Bill Clinton didn't want to let the terrorists win either, saying the game should go on. It would be 2 years before the right person was found. During that time, the bomber placed 2 more bombs in Georgia and 1 in Birmingham, Alabama. The resulting blasts caused several injuries and the death of a police officer. The bomber's name is Eric Rudolph, and he wouldn't be convicted until 2005. Rudolph pleaded guilty to federal charges stemming from the 4 bombings. He is now serving 4 life sentences for Atlanta and other bombings. Michael Barrasone, an Olympic rider who was 57 at the time, said that he was defending himself when he shot Lauren Kanarek twice in the chest in August 2019 at his training center and farm. Kanarek and her fiancé were living on the farm, but a feud escalated when Barrasone and his fiancé moved into a barn on the property. Barrasone claimed Kanarek mentally abused him. Barrasone faced 2 counts of attempted murder and 2 counts of possession of a weapon for an unlawful purpose. Over the 2-week trial, Barrasone's lawyer, Edward J. Belinkas, accused Kanarek of subjecting Barrasone to mental abuse that caused him to shoot her. Belinkas said that in the moments leading up to the shooting, Kanarek and her fiancé, Robert Goodwin, had beaten Barrasone and had their dog attack him. Belinkas said Kanarek had also made inflammatory social media posts about Barrasone. In the days before the shooting, Barrasone had called several times, claiming that Kanarek and her fiancé were squatters and were harassing him. In one call, Barrison described the conflict as a war, and it's going to be dealt with. Kenrick survived the shooting but was placed in a medically induced coma and had extensive surgery to repair her left lung. When she recovered, Kenrick was met with a deluge of social media comments from Barrison's supporters who blamed her for the shooting and said that she deserved it. Support for Barrison's case was upheld by his standing within the sport. Barrison was a reserve rider on the United States dressage team in the 2008 Olympics and coached Olympians like Alison Brock, one of the riders for the United States team that won a bronze in the 2016 Rio de Janeiro Games. Kenrick had used Facebook to detail her long-running dispute with Barrison. 5 days before she was shot, Kenrick warned that her life was in danger. A jury in Morris County found Barrison not guilty by reason of insanity for 1 count of first-degree attempted murder and 1 count of second-degree possession of a weapon. The jury also found Barrison not guilty of aggravated assault and weapons charges. He was committed civilly to a psychiatric facility and released from custody in November 2023 after 17 months. The Olympic Games have long stood as the ultimate show of human excellence, a stage where the world's most gifted athletes push the boundaries of physical and mental endurance. Yet the darker chapters of this storied tradition reveal a sobering truth about the human condition. While these Olympians have achieved remarkable feats, their stories are also interwoven with tragedy and crime. Even the most extraordinary talents cannot shield one from life's harsh realities. From the courtroom dramas of Oscar Pistorius and Riddick Bowe to the tragic deaths of athletes like Dave Schultz and Christopher Brathwaite, the narratives of these individuals are reminders of our shared vulnerability. The tragedies and criminal acts involving Olympians really show that despite their public personas of invincibility and achievement, they are not immune to the frailties and struggles that define the human experience. Olympians, like all of us, are subject to the transmutability of life and death, and their stories, whether of triumph or tragedy, highlight the often cruel intersection of extraordinary talent with the complexities of human life. Thus, the Olympic legacy, while a display of human greatness, also remains an ever-present reminder of our common humanity and its inherent fragility. This concludes today's story. For more real-life true stories, subscribe to the channel. Until next time.